Japan entered 1941 with the weight of destiny pressing against its shoulders. In the minds of its leaders, the empire stood at a crossroads with only two paths: expansion or extinction. The United States had frozen Japan's assets and cut off vital oil shipments. Without fuel, the empire's war in China would slowly bleed to death. Without access to raw materials, its dreams of a Pacific dominion would crumble like paper in the rain. And so, eyes turned toward a distant Hawaiian harbor. The Imperial Japanese Navy believed that if they could cripple the American Pacific Fleet with one decisive strike, they could buy the empire the breathing room it needed. A dramatic blow. A punch so shocking that the Americans might sue for peace before they even had time to throw a counterstrike. That belief guided every hand that planned what was about to unfold. Far to the north, at a secret anchorage called Hidokapu Bay, the first air fleet gathered. 6 aircraft carriers, the pride of Japan, waited in the cold like coiled dragons. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zuikaku. Upon their decks, the most skilled naval aviators the world had ever seen up to that point. Pilots honed to perfection by years of brutal combat over China. Among them was a man named Mitsuo Fuchida. He had trained relentlessly for this mission, studying maps of Pearl Harbor until he could see every mooring and runway in his sleep. He believed in the importance of the strike, but even he understood the immense gamble they were taking. The man who truly understood the risk better than anyone was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Once a student in the United States, he had walked American streets, seen American factories, peered into America's future. He knew exactly what kind of sleeping giant Japan was preparing to kick. Yet he also knew Japan had no other choice. As the carrier task force slipped into the vast Pacific, silence cloaked them. No radios, no unnecessary noise. Just focus, just anticipation, just the rhythmic rumble of the engines pushing them toward destiny. Inside their cockpits, pilots rehearsed the attack in their minds. Battleships rode neatly along Battleship Row. Airfields with aircraft lined wingtip to wingtip like eggs in a nest. Perfect target. Perfect moment. December 7th, 1941 arrived with a beautiful Hawaiian sunrise. Calm water. Blue sky. For many Americans, it was a quiet Sunday. For Japan, it was the most important morning in its modern history. Fuchida raised his signal flare. His voice pierced the airwaves. Tora! 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 The code that confirmed total surprise. Dive bombers dropped from the heavens like hawks with talons outstretched. Torpedo planes skimmed the waves so low their landing gear nearly kissed the water. Fighters spread out to control the skies. Then came the explosions. Battleships shuddered as steel split open. Arizona, Nevada, Oklahoma. Fireballs erupted into pillars of black smoke that scratched into the peaceful morning like a curse being carved into the sky. American sailors scrambled in confusion and disbelief. Gun crews ran barefoot. Some fired rifles at aircraft streaking overhead. The harbor became a battlefield in seconds. Bombs crashed through decks and detonated in engine rooms. Ships pitched to one side, struggling for breath like wounded giants. Oil spread across the water, and flames turned the harbor into a fiery mirror. The first wave withdrew, but the second came like a relentless echo. From the cockpit of his bomber, Lieutenant Zenji Abe watched the harbor vanish beneath plumes of smoke so thick they seemed to erase the island itself. He expected to feel triumph. Instead, he felt something stranger, something he couldn't quite name. Then came the order to return home. As Japanese pilots headed back across the Pacific, their hearts surged with adrenaline and awe. They had done it. They had executed the strike with precision. They had destroyed battleships and thousands of American lives. Their training had proven flawless. Japan rejoiced, believing they had crippled the Pacific Fleet. Cheers erupted in Tokyo. Newspapers declared the birth of a new age. The empire's destiny felt unstoppable. But already small cracks of doubt formed. The American aircraft carriers weren't in the harbor. Fuel depots remained untouched. Repair yards stood ready to resurrect the fleet. The tactical victory was a masterpiece. The strategic outcome was a question mark. Even as celebrations roared, Admiral Yamamoto stood quietly apart from the jubilation. He knew Americans well enough to fear the price of provoking them. "We have awakened a sleeping giant," he whispered to a colleague, and filled him with a terrible resolve. Japan had scored the knockout punch it dreamed of, but it had punched a fighter who always got off the mat. The return to Japan was filled with spreading stories of glory. Pilots were treated like heroes come home from Olympus. Children waved flags. Newspapers printed triumphant headlines. Imperial propaganda painted Pearl Harbor as the moment the world acknowledged Japan's ascendance. Yet among the naval staff, the mood was not entirely celebratory. Reports began flowing in. Survivors, damage assessments, American shipyard capabilities. What Japan believed would take years to repair, American engineers accomplished in months. The sunken battleships of Pearl Harbor rose again like resurrected warriors. Nevada steamed away. West Virginia returned. Even the battered Oklahoma was refloated. The pilots who had flown through smoke and flame now stared in disbelief at photos of the American fleet returning to service in time for battles still ahead. Even worse, Japan discovered the Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers, the true capital ships of future warfare, had been spared entirely. Instead of defeating the United States militarily, Pearl Harbor had galvanized it emotionally. Factories erupted into life like smelters preparing the furnace of fate. Men enlisted faster than uniforms could be sewn for them. Women stepped into production lines and built the mightiest engine of war the world had ever seen. Yamamoto saw it unfolding. The difference was math. Cold, merciless, devastating math. In a single year, the United States produced nearly 100,000 aircraft. Japan, in its best year, managed a fraction of that. Every Japanese zero that fell was nearly irreplaceable. Every American fighter that burned had 4 replacements rolling off assembly lines. Pilots noticed the change in the air. Gone were the early days of dominance over Chinese skies. Now, American planes were faster, stronger, harder hitting. P-38 Lightnings, F-6F Hellcats, F-4U Corsairs. Japan's aces fought bravely, but the tide surged higher with every month. Then came the Battle of Midway, for Japanese carriers turned to sunken tombs. Elite aircrews lost not over years, but in a single day. One pilot later wrote, "We had trained our entire lives. America had trained for a few months, and still they came." After Midway, Japan fought with skill, but without hope of regeneration. Fuel dwindled. Training shortened. Recruits became casualties faster than they could learn. In June 1944, the Japanese air arm was crushed in the skies of the Marianas. A massacre remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Young pilots, barely capable of landing on a carrier, were sent to fight veterans who had mastered the art of industrialized war. What Japan's warriors finally understood was not that America had willpower. They understood something far more terrifying. America had gears, steel, factories, labor, and oil. The quiet engine halls of Detroit, Seattle, Pittsburgh, and Los Angeles became Japan's most deadly opponents. Pearl Harbor had been a blow delivered not to destroy America, but to transform it. And now, the empire that once seemed unstoppable was shrinking. City by city, fleet by fleet, island by island. By 1945, the men who survived from the first wave of Pearl Harbor saw their nation in flames. Cities erased by firebombs, industry smashed, food scarce, the rising sun sinking beneath shadows of B-29s. Japan surrendered in August. Surviving pilots looked at American carriers anchored in Tokyo Bay and finally understood the truth. Their greatest achievement on December 7th had been to write the first line of their own defeat. Pearl Harbor was never a victory. It was the first chapter in a story that could only end one way, with the sleeping giant wide awake, towering over the Pacific, and building a future Japan could never outproduce. They had once flown as heroes, cutting through the sky as if destiny itself guided their wings. But as 1943 and 1944 dragged onward, those same Japanese aviators found themselves haunted by a single thought. Pearl Harbor had not ended a war. It had only summoned a far greater one. Many of the men who took off that December morning never returned from later battles. Those who survived carried invisible scars. Confidence gave way to doubt. Doubt slowly fermented into fear. The bravest aviators Japan had ever trained now looked back on Pearl Harbor with a mixture of pride and regret, like a sword master remembering the flawless strike that started a duel he couldn't hope to finish. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, who once felt exhilaration watching the harbor engulfed in chaos, later confessed that Pearl Harbor became a weight on his spirit. He had seen America's response during later missions. He witnessed flak erupt over Pacific Islands with mechanical consistency. He saw Hellcats and Corsairs streak toward them like steel predators who multiplied faster than Japan could even count. One evening in a remote Pacific airfield, Abe sat among the last veterans of the early glory days. The younger pilots around them laughed anxiously, pretending not to feel the cold dread of the missions they would soon fly. Abe stared at the sunset and spoke softly, as if to the dying light itself. We struck first, but we did not break them. We only awakened them. No one disagreed. Every pilot who had lived long enough to understand the war's truth knew that their fate was sealed by factories they would never see. As they sat in makeshift mess halls or waited in silence beside their aircraft, they pictured the distant rumble of American industry like a monster breathing fire over the horizon. They fought like tigers. America fought like a continent. The math carved into their hearts was merciless. For every Japanese ace who fell, the loss cut deep. A warrior trained from youth. A living investment in skill. A legacy lost forever. For every American pilot who fell, a replacement arrived with more fuel, more hours of training, and a brand new aircraft fresh off the assembly line. Japan's warriors battled fiercely, but with each mission, they understood their numbers shrinking. The skies were turning against them, not because they lacked courage or skill, but because courage and skill could not manufacture airplanes. Eventually, the Imperial Navy could no longer afford to protect its best men. The aces who should have stayed home to train the future instead died, exhausting their dwindling strength. New pilots were rushed into the cockpit with fewer than 100 flight hours total. Some had never fired their guns in practice. They launched into the blue without confidence, guided only by desperation and the ghosts of mentors who once ruled the skies. Meanwhile, the Americans flowed forward with unstoppable momentum. The P-38s that once felt rare now came in swarms. The B-29s flew so high that Japanese fighters struggled even to reach them. One pilot recalled seeing a formation of U.S. bombers cutting through the air like a floating city. I counted 40, then stopped counting. There was no point. In earlier years, fighters would escort their bombers like a shield of wings. Now, bombers escorted each other because there were so many of them. Each Japanese flight mission became a countdown not to victory but to survival. And survival was a luxury fewer pilots experienced as months slipped away. On nights when sleep refused to come, aviators lay awake remembering the early cheers after Pearl Harbor. Those same cheers now echoed like ghosts mocking their confidence. A young pilot named Yamada once asked his commander, "How did we misjudge the Americans so badly?" The commander answered without emotion, "We saw their pride. We saw their culture. But we could not see their factories." The truth spread through Japan like smoke. The industrial juggernaut unleashed by December 7th was too vast, too determined, too relentless. It was not a sleeping giant that Japan had awakened. It was a giant forging weapons faster than any blow could knock them aside. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of the attack he never wanted to launch, already knew this truth in his bones. In meetings, he watched confidence around him fade like the last embers of a dying fire. Officers still saluted proudly, but hesitation creased their brows. Eyes drifted toward doors as if fearing the arrival of the next report filled with new losses. Yamamoto once wrote privately, "The fate of the empire was sealed the moment the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor." But he never dared say it aloud. Not while hope still flickered in the hearts of those who believed honor alone could keep them aloft. Yet honor could not fuel engines, and bravery could not replace the fallen. By late 1944, the experienced fighter arm of the Imperial Navy had evaporated. Every new pilot who took off was flying into a sky dominated by an enemy growing stronger by the day. And slowly, painfully, Japanese pilots began to realize that death in combat was no longer the price of victory, but the cost of delaying defeat. Pearl Harbor, once their proudest triumph, now loomed over them like a shadow that stretched longer with every month of war. Some wondered if it might have been better not to strike at all. Others believed they had no choice. All agreed the end had been set in motion on that December morning. The clarity of hindsight settled heavy in their hearts. They had flown into Pearl Harbor expecting to cripple a nation. Instead, they had ignited one, and that nation would not stop. Not until it buried the rising sun beneath waves of metal and thunder. Even as Japan's homeland trembled under bombing raids, surviving Pearl Harbor veterans clung to a fading hope that their sacrifices still meant something, that the empire might endure, that honor could still triumph over iron. But every passing day forced them to confront a harsher truth. The attack that once promised salvation had become the spark that lit the empire's funeral pyre. Pilots who once soared like hawks now slept beside their aircraft on island runways, knowing that sunrise might be their last. They wrote farewell letters they never intended to send yet kept hidden in breast pockets. A silent confession of doubt. What began with fire at Pearl Harbor would end with fire over Tokyo. And somewhere in those flame-scorched skies, the men who had unleashed the war understood at last. History had turned against them. The sleeping giant they awakened was not merely rising. It was rising to end them. The Japanese aircrews who returned to their carriers that morning expected celebration, commendation, perhaps even history's applause. They had trained for a moment of absolute triumph, and the rising sun insignia painted proudly on their aircraft glowed like the symbol of an unstoppable empire. Cheers erupted as the first Zero fighters and torpedo bombers successfully reclaimed their grip on the carrier decks. Men clapped shoulders, shouted victory, and chanted the name of Japan. The sea breeze carried adrenaline. Even hardened pilots allowed themselves the rare smile that comes from believing history has just tilted in your favor. Yet, beneath the celebration, a subtle unease lingered. Pilots knew what they did not see. There were no American carriers in the harbor. The prized fleet carriers Lexington, Enterprise, and Saratoga were nowhere to be found. The attack had destroyed battleships, symbols of power from a past generation. But in the evolution of naval warfare, the aircraft carrier had quietly stolen the throne. And Japan's primary targets had slipped away like ghosts. One young pilot, exhausted but sharp enough to read the moment, wrote in his logbook that evening. He said the silence where the American carriers should have been felt like an omen. A battle half won, a tiger only wounded. Admiral Yamamoto, who remained back in Japan, had not celebrated either. Upon receiving word of success, he stared into the distance, as though seeing a storm beyond the horizon. He famously warned that their victory had merely awakened a sleeping giant, and filled him with a terrible resolve. The pilots of the First Air Fleet did not yet grasp the meaning of those words. But soon they would, because while Japanese crews reveled in a job accomplished with precision and daring, tens of thousands of American workers were already stepping into factories across the nation. The industrial furnaces were lighting. The hammering of steel began to echo. The gears of a war machine larger than any in history roared to life. Japan had won a battle, but in the shadow of that triumph, a war had been set in motion that they could never hope to match. American workers, some who had heard the news only hours before, walked into factories and shipyards with their jaws clenched in determination. Housewives volunteered for jobs they had never imagined. Engineers redrew blueprints. Assembly lines once meant for automobiles began stamping out tanks and aircraft. Every bomb that fell on Pearl Harbor had not weakened American resolve. It had forged it. Back in the Pacific, the Japanese First Air Fleet sailed home under the winter sky. Pilots rested, officers reviewed what appeared to be flawless tactical execution, and naval planners prepared future operations designed to expand Japan's reach across the Pacific. Malaya, the Philippines, Wake Island, Guam. Victory seemed not merely possible but inevitable. Their strategy relied on striking lightning fast before the enemy could react. But they had just struck an enemy that did not retreat when wounded. It transformed. While ships still burned at Pearl Harbor, telegrams crossed the United States like sparks on a fuse. Men lined up outside recruitment offices that wrapped around the block. Farmers, students, machinists, and clerks stood shoulder to shoulder, united by anger and purpose. Across the Pacific, Japanese pilots began to notice something unsettling in their commander's tone. What began as triumphant declarations grew quieter, weighed down by a fear impossible to admit openly. The Americans were not collapsing. They were rising, and they were rising with a speed and scale that defied the mathematics of war Japan had always understood. Japan's industry relied on limited steel reserves, constrained shipping routes, and factories that needed precious time to produce every aircraft, every tank, every rifle. Time that war would not allow them. America, in contrast, possessed resources like an ocean without shores. Iron, oil, aluminum, manpower, engineers, railroads spanning thousands of miles. And now, motivation. Japanese aviators recorded their growing concern in diaries that would only be read years later. They wrote of the realization that while their victory that day had been glorious in sunlight, America's victory would be built in the darkness of factories, and it would come back heavier, louder, and relentless. In Tokyo, newspapers printed triumphant headlines celebrating the attack's brilliance. Children waved flags. Adults bowed reverently. Emperor Hirohito's subjects believed a new empire was dawning. But in private, Japan's best strategic minds battled the truth in their hearts. They had set into motion a war of production. And in that kind of war, Japan stood dangerously small. The pilots of Pearl Harbor, like Fuchida and Abe, would soon participate in battles they could not imagine while flying over Hawaii. Battles against enemies multiplied not by conscription alone, but by assembly lines that turned factories into arsenals and machines into wings of steel. The secret of Pearl Harbor was not the bombs that fell or the ships that sank. It was the moment Japan learned they had miscalculated the true battlefield. Not the waters of the Pacific, not the skies above the islands, but the very industrial soul of America. And as the first air fleet cut through the dark waves on its journey home, a quiet but irreversible truth already trailed behind them. Japan had woken something colossal, something they could not put back to sleep. Japan's first air fleet sailed back to home waters carrying pilots who believed they had crippled a sleeping enemy. Yet they returned to a world already shifting beneath their feet. For while Japanese naval planners drafted their next conquests in ink and confidence, America drafted its vengeance in steel. Across the United States, factories once dedicated to peaceful purpose began a transformation that stunned even those who oversaw it. Automakers turned assembly lines into rivers of rivets, gears, and armor plating. Steel mills roared louder than any artillery barrage. The air filled with the thunder of machinery that would forge the tools of global retribution. Every hour, new recruits stepped into uniforms dyed the color of commitment. Young men who had never seen the ocean prepared to fight on its farthest edges. Women who had never been allowed near industrial power took command of welding torches and milling machines, becoming the muscle behind a nation's new identity. America was no longer a slumbering giant. It was an awakened titan, calling upon its unmatched capacity not to merely respond to war, but to overwhelm it. In Tokyo, analysts tried to understand the numbers coming across their desks. They calculated potential aircraft output and shipbuilding timelines. They attempted to predict American strategy. What they failed to measure was American fury. Japan expected fear and hesitation. Instead, the United States answered the attack with a single unified emotion: resolve. Pearl Harbor had not broken American morale. It had solidified it like hot metal plunged into water. Within months, new carriers left shipyards with names like Essex and Yorktown. They emerged from construction not one at a time, but in fleets. America did not simply build replacements for what was lost. It built an armada that dwarfed Japan's greatest dreams. Pearl Harbor had ignited an industrial wildfire. Japanese intelligence reported that American aircraft deliveries approached inconceivable totals. Hundreds every week, thousands every month. bombers with ranges that spanned oceans, fighters that pushed speed toward the edge of physics, transport planes that carried the weight of war to every corner of the planet. Each report arrived like another curtain rising on the same growing truth. Japan's war plans were too small for the war they had started. Meanwhile, back in Japan, factories struggled to keep pace. Skilled labor was limited. Resources were finite. Production struggled not only against demand, but against the very geography of the nation. Surrounded by ocean, every ton of metal and fuel was a logistical gamble. And logistics, not bravery, would decide the length of empire. Japanese pilots who survived early victories began to notice subtle changes in their missions. Fuel shortages forced rationing. Aircraft maintenance stretched to dangerous delays. New planes arrived, but fewer than promised. Fewer than needed. Fewer than the Americans built in a single day. Confidence began to erode like coral in a storm tide. A pilot might down an enemy aircraft in a dogfight, but how long until the enemy returned with two to replace it? Japan's warriors fought fiercely, skillfully, often brilliantly. But their courage could not manufacture steel. Back in the United States, President Franklin Roosevelt visited factories that glowed day and night. Men and women cheered as he declared that America would build not thousands, but tens of thousands of planes. They did not doubt him. America had the tools, the raw material, and an iron determination shaped by smoke still rising over Pearl Harbor. Japan had weapons forged by experts. America had weapons forged by multitudes. And still, Japanese leaders pressed forward. They believed speed would be their ally. That by expanding rapidly across the Pacific, they could position themselves beyond the reach of American counterattack. That victory would arrive before America's factories could turn promise into power. But the factories moved faster than anyone expected. The hammering never stopped. Assembly lines grew longer. Ships spilled into the water so quickly that christening ceremonies became almost routine. The tide of war was shifting not on battlefields, but in blueprints. Japan had achieved shock at Pearl Harbor. But shock fades. Steel endures. In carrier-ready rooms and barracks across the Japanese fleet, pilots began to whisper rumors. They heard that America's new fighters could fly farther. That American bombers grew in size and numbers every week. That reinforcements arrived at the front faster than Japan could bury its dead. The pilots looked at each other and asked questions none dared speak aloud. How do you defeat an enemy who can rebuild faster than you can destroy? How do you exhaust a nation that does not understand the word surrender? Pearl Harbor had lit the fuse, but the explosion to come would not be Japan's triumph. It would be America's return. The war Japan had launched in hope of dominance would instead become a race. A race against production. A race against inevitability. A race Japan could never win. The Pacific Ocean, once thought of as Japan's shield, was becoming a battlefield that stretched to the horizon. The Imperial Japanese Navy's Zero fighters still cut elegant arcs through the sky. Their pilots remained among the most skilled in the world. Their early victories had shaped their belief that daring and agility would always triumph over mass and metal. But new shadows began to appear at the edges of each mission. Shadows that grew larger, faster, and more dangerous with every passing month. Rumors spread of American fighters that did not need to turn tightly to win. Aircraft that arrived at battle with the sun behind them, diving with merciless speed, shredding the air and the myth of Japanese air superiority. One day, a Japanese patrol encountered them for the first time. American Wildcats and newer Hellcats roared downward from altitude, guns blazing before the Japanese pilots could react. They streaked past, then climbed back into the heavens with a confidence that made Japanese pilots uneasy. The Zero still outturned them, still danced in close quarters like a sword fighter against a club-wielding brute, but the sense of dominance had shifted. The club was gaining reach. And then came the bombers. Not a pair, not a squadron. Waves. Each bomber that filled a Japanese pilot's gun sight felt like the front end of a growing storm. They were not the fragile, lightly defended aircraft Japan once enjoyed sweeping aside. These were armored titans, bristling with guns that spat dense walls of lead. The American crews, armed with Browning .50 caliber machine guns, defended their formation with cold precision. For every bomber damaged, two seemed to take its place. Every loss Japan inflicted was swallowed by an American replacement before the wreckage hit the ocean. Japanese pilots returned to their carriers with bullet holes punched into wings, oil bleeding from engines, and a new understanding settling into their chests. The Americans had changed. Fighting the United States in 1941 had been a duel. By early 1943, it had become an industrial avalanche. Back in mainland Japan, officers studied intelligence reports with expressions carved from stone. Charts and graphs painted the air war's future in harsh colors. Every time a zero fell flaming into the sea, Japan lost an irreplaceable resource. Their best pilots were veterans trained over years, not months. Each one represented thousands of hours of flight experience. Meanwhile, America filled cockpit after cockpit with new aviators fresh from schools that multiplied like factories. Japan had elite fighters. America had endless fighters. The more the Imperial Navy battled, the more its strength bled away. And with it, so did the pilots' confidence. They still believed in their skill. They still believed in honor, discipline, and the code of Bushido that demanded victory or death. But belief can grow heavy when matched against the grinding gears of inevitability. During debriefings, squadron leaders began changing their vocabulary. Words like superiority disappeared. Words like survival took their place. In one briefing room, a young pilot stared at a map dotted with arrows and circles marking American operations. The symbols multiplied each week. The ocean around Japan was being rewritten. Territories that once belonged to the empire began slipping through its fingers. He asked quietly, "If they are already this strong, what will they be next year?" No one answered. Meanwhile, American carrier groups spread across the Pacific like brush fires too numerous to contain. They struck the Solomons, the Gilberts, the Marshalls. Islands Japan had conquered with blood were now becoming stepping stones for an enemy capable of building airfields faster than Japan could destroy them. At night, Japanese pilots stared into the darkness, haunted by thoughts more frightening than any bullet. What if the path home itself could be taken? What if the empire could be surrounded? For the first time, Japanese war planners saw the lines of defense tightening. Their ambitions had pushed outward like a rising tide, but tides recede. And with every victory Japan once celebrated, the Americans were learning how to counter the Zero's agility, learning how to fight Japan at altitude, learning how to project power farther than any nation had before. The United States was not merely replacing what it lost. It was upgrading. Every new American plane that appeared seemed forged from the lessons of yesterday's battles. Stronger armor, more firepower, greater range, engines with the strength of deep thunder. And just beyond the curtain of time, a new predator prepared to enter the war. A fighter longer-legged than anything seen before, carrying destruction across entire oceans. The P-51 Mustang. Japan did not yet know it, but the sky was about to belong to America. Perceptions had changed. Technology had changed. The balance of war had changed. The first air fleet had awakened the giant. And the giant was learning how to fly. The sun rose over the Pacific like a spotlight revealing vulnerability. Japan's pilots still took to the skies with courage, but courage alone could not erase the growing weight of numbers stacked against them. In the first months after Pearl Harbor, Japanese fighters seemed untouchable. They sliced through American defenses with ballet-like grace. But grace is not armor. Beauty does not block bullets. The Zero, once the master of the sky, began to show its age. American pilots, once hesitant and outmatched, had become students in the harshest classroom imaginable. Their textbooks were dogfights, their pencils tracer rounds, and every lesson was written in survival. They learned never to twist and turn with a Zero. Instead, they learned to dive, climb, and strike like falcons descending from the sun. This shift in tactics was the first crack. The second came from a much quieter weapon: information. High above the waves, American radar nets stretched outward like unseen spiderwebs, catching the movement of enemy formations long before their engines could be heard. Radio intelligence began unraveling the once enigmatic Japanese operations. The fog of war that had protected Japan's strategy began thinning, replaced by clarity. On American islands turned fortresses, fighters scrambled before Japanese planes fully appeared on the horizon. Surprise, Japan's most prized advantage, was evaporating into the morning sky. And behind every alert siren, behind every successful intercept, stood a growing industrial heartbeat that never slowed. Japan had gambled on speed. America countered with inevitability. Meanwhile, deep inside war rooms in Tokyo, admirals studied maps with mounting concern. Their empire stretched wide, wrapping across the Pacific like a paper dragon. But paper, no matter how beautifully folded, is easily burned. Every island demanded planes and pilots to defend it. Every mile conquered became a mile that needed protecting. Supply lines stretched thin across waters now threatened by American submarines. Fuel shortages began to creep like shadows into every decision. Then came the moment that changed everything. Midway, an island small enough to miss on a globe, but large enough to decide the fate of the Pacific. Japan believed it was the perfect bait. The American carriers would surely rush to defend what looked like an exposed position. What the Imperial Navy did not realize was that the Americans were already waiting. Codebreakers had unlocked Japan's plans, revealing intentions thought hidden behind layers of deception. The battlefield was not only physical, it was intellectual, and the United States had quietly seized the high ground. On the morning of the attack, Japanese pilots launched confidently into the sky, believing victory already written. Their first bombs ignited Midway's defenses, sending plumes of smoke rising like dark omens. But below the clouds, American torpedo bombers, hopelessly outmatched and mercilessly shot down, bought time with their sacrifice. They drew the Zeros downward. They scattered Japan's fighter cover. They created chaos in the calm mind of the First Air Fleet. And in that moment of disarray, the sky tore open. American dive bombers plunged like steel-wing judgment. In mere minutes, 3 Japanese carriers erupted in fire that howled into the heavens. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu. Proud ships turned to floating pyres. Pilots who once believed in invincibility watched flames devour everything they had built. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, fought back with desperate ferocity. But the outcome was no longer a battle. It was a reckoning. Japan had lost its elite carrier air groups, pilots trained over years, officers whose expertise shaped the empire's reach. Experience that could not be replaced, not by training, not by hope, not by prayer. As the sun set that night, imperial commanders confronted a new and chilling reality. Victory had moved out of reach. From now on, the war would be about survival. Yet they kept fighting. Honor demanded it. Culture required it. The empire pushed forward with clenched teeth and silent fear. Because once an empire is set in motion, momentum often continues long after destiny turns away. Above the charred remains of Japan's pride, the Pacific wind carried a message into the future. The sky now belonged to America. The Solomon Islands, steaming jungles, mud that swallowed boot leather, skies that punished mistakes with instant death. Here, Japan's pilots faced a war unlike the ones from their triumphant past. The imperial expansion that once seemed unstoppable now met an enemy who refused to stop growing. American aircraft appeared more frequently. They arrived with escorts. They arrived with radar coordination. They arrived with steady logistics that Japan could no longer match. The battles over Guadalcanal became a deadly accounting of skill versus endurance. Japan still had the former. America possessed an endless reservoir of the latter. Every Japanese replacement pilot arrived with fewer hours of training than the one before. Some barely understood their aircraft before combat baptized them in fire. Meanwhile, Americans arrived with confidence forged from months of fighting and teaching one another everything they learned. Experience, Japan's most valuable currency, was draining into the sea. As American fighters improved, so did their tactics. They carried altitude like a sword above their enemies' heads. Engagements began not with Zero pilots hunting victims, but with Japanese pilots scanning the open sky for predators. Even the most decorated aces felt unease. They climbed into cockpits no longer feeling like warriors launching into glory, but like men stepping into measured risks. Their skill held back collapse, but skill can only delay a flood, not stop it. The skies above the Solomons echoed with a new kind of silence. Doubt. Meanwhile, American supply convoys delivered fresh aircraft like gifts from a giant who never slept. P-38 Lightnings slashed across combat zones with twin-engine menace. Wildcats evolved into Hellcats, shedding weakness for raw power. The war in the sky had transformed into an upward climb Japan could not endure. In smoky briefing rooms lit by flickering lamps, commanding officers wore expressions carved from fatigue. Maps became confessions of shrinking options. Defensive zones contracted like a wounded animal curling around its heart. But the Empire refused to look inward. Orders came: fight harder, sacrifice more, show the world the spirit of the samurai. Japanese pilots obeyed. They always obeyed. Yet in the privacy of their thoughts they wondered, what spirit fights steel? What honor conquers mathematics? On American carriers, fresh pilots joked nervously as they prepared to launch. Hundreds of them. Thousands. They felt fear too. But fear spread thin when divided among so many who could replace one another tomorrow. For Japanese pilots, fear concentrated like poison. A zero ace once proud of his victory count now stared at his dwindling squadron. Men he had trained now vanished into explosions that barely earned a line in reports. He realized his greatest opponent was not the enemy pilot behind him, but the enormous machine behind all enemy pilots everywhere. The war had changed shape. It was no longer a contest of fighters. It was a contest of factories. Japan's factories needed miracles. America's factories needed gasoline. And gasoline, unlike miracles, could be delivered by the millions of barrels. The Solomons became a graveyard of hope. Each island pried away was a reminder that Japan's outward expansion had been a mask. Beneath the victories lay a fragile core, built on limited resources and surrounded by growing threats. The pilots who once looked outward toward conquest now gazed homeward in fear of what might come next. The truth haunted every cockpit. The empire was shrinking. The enemy was multiplying. And the sky was no longer theirs. In the twilight of the Third Reich, the once soaring eagles of the Luftwaffe fell back to earth like broken constellations. Their famed aces, who once carved their names in the clouds, were now trapped in a sky choked with Allied firepower. American Mustangs and Thunderbolts slashed through the air with radios that spoke in lightning and engines that never tired. The Luftwaffe's wings, once symbols of terror and dominance, cracked under the weight of overwhelming speed, steel, and strategy. Airfields that once thundered with the roar of Messerschmitts fell quiet beneath the relentless rhythm of Allied bombers. Factories that gave Germany its wings were smashed into twisted skeletons of steel and silence. And the young men who climbed into those last, desperate fighters, many were barely trained, trembling not only from cold fear but from the knowledge they were being sent into a sky already lost. The Luftwaffe did not collapse all at once. It suffered a long, agonizing fall. Fuel vanished, parts vanished, pilots vanished, and by 1945, the very skies that once served as Germany's shield had betrayed them, turning into a vast and merciless battlefield where hope simply ran out of altitude. Those few who survived captivity would look back and speak of a truth too heavy for pride to bear. They were overwhelmed not by one miracle machine, nor one enemy ace, but by a nation that understood the future belonged to those who commanded the air with radios, logistics, and numbers that no single pilot's skill could overcome. The war ended, and the silence over Europe grew into an unbearable reminder. The Luftwaffe, once the cutting edge of warfare's evolution, became a cautionary ghost. Its rise, meteoric. Its destruction, absolute. And so, when history looks up at that wartime sky, it sees a lesson written in contrails and shattered dreams. No empire, no force, not even the fiercest arsenal of aces, can escape the gravity of reality forever. The sky, once their dominion, became their downfall.